People say that Game of Thrones is just War of the Roses put down in a fantasy world. They say this as though that's simple, as though taking a historical plotline and creating an epic best-selling saga out of it is an easy thing. Is it though? Because you have to understand the historical forces behind that plotline. You have to understand the characters that drive the story. You have to integrate enough fantasies to please the fans of the genre. And you have to do that integration in such a way that the culture still fits the plotline you're writing. All of that sounds pretty complicated, but actually, there is a fairly easy way, a recipe to follow, if you will. And that is what I want to talk about today. How to take historical plot lines and turn them into epic fantasy history and stories. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. To craft a great fantasy world inspired by history, understanding the broad forces shaping historical periods is crucial. This strategy is vividly demonstrated in Ken Liu's The Dandelion Dynasty, where the rise of the Han Dynasty in China serves as the foundation for a rich secondary world. Unlike traditional fantasies dominated by magic, Liu's world prioritizes engineering and innovation, mirroring the Han Dynasty's emphasis on exploration, invention, and the tension between tradition and innovation. In the Dandelion Dynasty, characters who are engineers, innovators, and strategists lead the narrative, reflecting the pragmatic spirit of the Han Dynasty. This setting doesn't directly replicate historical events, but instead it captures the essence of the era, its focus on technological advancement, and the philosophical debates that shaped its governance. So to build such a world, you really have to understand those technological and philosophical forces that shape a historical period. But there is more to it than that. It is equally important to consider economic forces and their impact on societies. A prime example of this from our world is the Silk Road. This ancient network of trade routes fundamentally transformed the economies, cultures, and political landscapes of the regions it spanned, from China through the Middle East all the way to Europe. The Silk Road did more than just facilitate the exchange of luxury goods. It was a conduit for cultural exchange, spreading religions, philosophies, and innovations across continents. Cities along the Silk Road, such as Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan, flourished into hubs of commerce and melting pots of diverse cultures, languages, and ideas. In a fantasy setting, imagining a world with its own version of the Silk Road can add depth to world building. Consider how such a trade network might influence the political intrigue of your story, create cultural exchanges that enrich the tapestry of your world, or even introduce exotic magical items or knowledge. A fantasy Silk Road could serve as a backdrop for stories of espionage, adventure, and exploration, reflecting the economic dynamics that drive historical change and applying these principles to the fabric of a new, imagined world. And for my thoughts on how to build a Silk Road or other overland trade routes, check out my video on the topic. To create a world that feels authentic, you must understand and incorporate the environmental, cultural, philosophical, and economic forces that define a historical period. Let's take a familiar example, that of feudal societies. A myriad of fantasy worlds use feudal societies, but most of them neglect the history of how feudalism arose in the first place. The rise of feudalism in Europe stemmed from a need to organize society amidst chaos and disorder, leading to a system of reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals. So, all those worlds with their feudal systems, they should have the right historical conditions, such as anarchy or the collapse of a central power, to logically give rise to a system of feudalism. By focusing on the fundamental forces behind historical developments, rather than on specific dates or events, writers can craft worlds that resonate with the readers. This method allows for the creation of cultures and societies that, while fantastical, are grounded in the logical progression of their own world's history. It's not about replicating history, but about understanding the dynamics that drive social and historical change and applying these principles to the fabric of a new imagined world. But of course, it's not all about broad sweeping forces. Some of history is cool because of the tactics and technology available at the time and the events that they drove. So, employ some technology now, hit that thumbs up button, and let's talk about the Powder Mage trilogy. Integrating historical and military tactics and technology into fantasy world building not only enhances the realism, but it also deepens the narrative's complexity. This approach is exemplified in Brian McClelland's The Powder Mage trilogy, which draws inspiration from the European warfare of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly echoing the French Revolution. McClelland incorporates the era's military tactics and fervor into his narrative, centering guns not just as weapons, but as pivotal elements of his magic system. This integration gives rise to the fantastic concept of powder mages, who are at the heart of the series' revolutionary conflicts. So, when adapting historical periods for fantasy, it is crucial to consider how tactics were shaped by technology of the time and how that will change or how that can be influenced due to magic. For instance, the formation of phalanxes in ancient warfare was driven by the technologies of spear and sling. The Romans transitioned away from phalanxes when they adopted the oval shields or scuta of the Samnites. The Roman tortoise went out of fashion with the development of heavily armored cavalry, and so on. But what happens if you introduce a mage who can replicate the effect of heavily armored cavalry by crashing into the infantry? So you need to consider how magic will affect that technology and how that will affect the tactics and strategy derived from that technology. This will create a believable and immersive world where military strategies and the technology that enables them are logically consistent with the setting's development level and magic. McClelland's work serves as a prime example of how to elevate the integration between tactics and technology by weaving magic into the technological fabric. The powder mages, with their ability to manipulate gunpowder and make amazing shots, demonstrate how a fantasy world's magic can be deeply intertwined with its technological advancements. And that not only showcases the inventive possibilities of magic, but also grounds the fantastical elements in a recognizable historical context, making the world more relatable and immersive for the reader. The key to this strategy is to understand the technology of the time period you're looking to adapt and to understand how that technology shaped the warfare tactics of that world. This is also a great place to ask, what if? What if guns were introduced earlier in the timeline? Or later? What if a printing press was never invented and it all stayed at block printing? What if the steam engine was invented during the Bronze Age and pushed mining carts along wooden rails? Those are all great questions to ask to create a really unique and distinctive world just by changing the technology or introducing magic. But not everything is about technology and tactics. The events of history are often driven by conflicts between groups. If you're finding value in this video, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about creating the factions and the conflict between them. History is rich in factions and conflict, and it serves as a fertile ground for story inspiration. Guy Gavriel Kay exemplifies this approach in his series, The Sarantine Mosaic. He draws on the complex political and religious landscape of the Byzantium Empire under Justinian I. Kay crafts a narrative deeply rooted in the era's conflicts, particularly focusing on the religious schism between the eastern and western branches of the Christian Church. This historical period's intricacies provide a backdrop for exploring themes of power, belief, and cultural expression, including the role of art in religion. And that's probably the reason why I enjoyed this series so much. I love me some art in fantasy stories. And if you're interested on my thoughts on incorporating arts and the relationship between patrons and artists in fantasy, check out my video on that topic. Another great historical example of factional dynamics is the Aztec Triple Alliance between Tenochtitlan. Okay, I am going to mispronounce these Aztec cities' names something fierce. I'm trying, but it's not it's nowhere close to my native language. Triple Alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. These city-states, while allied, had their internal disputes and competitions. My cat wants to say hello. There we go. Hello, my boy. This is D'Artagnan. That's my baby. All right. You want to sit on my lap while I talk? So these city-states had their conflicts, but eventually there was the dominance of Tenochtitlan, which showcases how alliances can shift and evolve, leading to a change in power dynamics. When adapting historical factions into a fantasy setting, it's crucial to recognize that conflict doesn't solely arise from outright war. The nuanced disagreements, competing interests, and ideological differences within and between factions can also drive the plot. Even allies, as seen in the example of Justinian and the Christian Church, can experience tension and conflict that enrich the narrative. So, when using historical factions as my inspiration, these are the steps that I follow to transport them to my world. 1. Identify historical factions present in the period. Figure out their beliefs, goals, and relationships with each other. 2. Adapt these factions into your fantasy world and amplify their differences or conflicts to suit your narrative needs. 3. Integrate internal conflicts within the factions as well as external conflicts between the factions. And 4. Avoid painting any faction as entirely good or entirely evil. Drawing from history shows the complexity and nuance in each faction's motivations and actions, reflecting the multifaceted nature of human societies. So, by using these steps, you can create factions that come with inbuilt conflict, both internally and externally, and that can drive the tension and the plot of your stories. And now, let's draw together this whole topic with reference to George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. Bringing historical events and characters into fantasy narratives involves more than just transplanting the past into a secondary world. And George R.R. Martin's approach in A Song of Ice and Fire exemplifies a masterful blend of historical inspiration with imaginative world building. So, here is a streamlined version of how Martin integrates history into his fantasy series, and how you can apply similar strategies in your own writing. First, you need to understand the historical parallels. Martin doesn't merely replicate the War of the Roses. He adapts its essence. The conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York is mirrored in the strife between the Lannisters and the Starks, respectively. However, those houses didn't come from nowhere, and Martin dives deeper into the historical context, drawing on the Plantagenet dynasty's internal conflicts to inspire the Targaryens' complex history. And as the Plantagenets set the stage for the War of the Roses, so the Targaryens set the stage for the War of Five Kings. But you also need to adapt historical cultures and religions. The Christian faith's influence during the War of the Roses is reimagined in the faith of the Seven. Martin transforms the church into a polytheistic religion, but he retains the essence of his historical religious dynamics, including the rise of a militant church. And then, of course, you need characters to make all this work, and Martin skillfully blends historical figures with fictional elements to create complex characters. Tyrion Lannister has echoes of Richard III, while Cersei Lannister parallels Elizabeth Woodville. Martin also draws on Roman history. Stannis is pretty clearly inspired by Emperor Tiberius, exiled to a lonely island and seeing enemies in every shadow. What Martin does with his characters is he understands the forces that shape them, like having an ambitious mother or being born cruel, having been neglected in the line of succession your whole life, and so on. He understands those forces and uses them to shape characters that still fit the narrative, even though they come from different eras in our history. A Song of Ice and Fire weaves together elements from disparate times. It mingles Roman history with medieval European events and draws also from Asia. And this creates a rich, multifaceted world. This blending works because Martin grasps the underlying forces shaping historical events and characters. Understanding the ambition, manipulation, and power dynamics allows these elements to resonate within the fantasy setting. The key to Martin's success is his ability to use history not as a strict blueprint, but as a rich tapestry of inspiration. He identifies universal themes and dynamics, ambition, conflict, the struggle for power, and transposes them into his world. This method ensures the narrative feels both familiar and fresh, grounded in the human experience, and yet free to explore fantastical horizons. Now, on to the important part, applying these strategies in your world building. 1. Understand the forces at play in your historical period of interest. Look beyond the surface events to the underlying dynamics and tensions. 2. Use history as a starting point, but don't be afraid to modify elements to serve your narrative. Combine different historical influences to enrich your world. 3. Identify themes that transcend time and place: power, betrayal, ambition, freedom. Use those themes to connect your fantasy world with your historical inspiration. 4. Integrate fantastical elements seamlessly with historical inspiration. Let magic and mythology complement the historical aspects of your world, creating a setting that is both imaginative and believable. And 5. Draw on historical figures for character inspiration, but enrich them with your own creative twists. Understand the historical person's essence and the forces that shaped them, like an ambitious mother or a cruel nature. Then consider how similar traits would manifest in the unique circumstances of your fantasy world. So here's an exercise for you. Pick a lesser-known historical event and brainstorm ways to adapt its core dynamics into a fantasy setting. Let me know in the comments what you came up with. Now, I said 4 strategies, but there is a 5th element. So if you've stuck around, welcome to the true key. It is important that you consider how the fantasy elements of your world is going to impact these plots and storylines. Does it bring in new technology? Does it change the way people make war? Are there new factions associated with magic? You need to decide which elements will be impacted by the fantastical, whether it's your fantasy species or your magic or the fantastical elements of your geography, and those that will be impacted, you need to wind the clock back and make certain that you embed the fantastical properly into your history. One of the biggest risks in using history is that you can end up with a world where it feels as though fantasy was just pasted on top of history. I have read books that feel like this, and they don't read well. So how do you prevent this? 1. Define the nature and scope of fantasy elements. Clearly define what fantastical elements you're introducing into your world. Are these elements widespread and commonly known among the inhabitants of your world, or are they rare and mystical? Decide whether you're incorporating magic, mythical creatures, fantastical geography, or unique technologies. And for guidance on doing that, check out my podcast, World Building Blueprints, playlist in the information card. You have to pull these elements, these fantastical elements, through into your daily life, your societal norms, and the broader world. Does magic replace traditional technology, or does it exist alongside it? How does the presence of mythical creatures affect trade, agriculture, or warfare? Understanding this scope allows you to gauge the extent to which these elements should influence historical developments and societal structures. So, 2. Now you've got all your elements, but how do you embed them into your world's history? You need to wind that clock back and determine how they've shaped the events of your history. If magic exists, How did it influence the rise and fall of empires, the outcome of crucial battles, or the development of cities and civilizations? If there are fantastical creatures, consider their role in mythology, religion, cultural practices. Develop key historical events that were directly influenced by these fantasy elements. This could include wars fought with magical weapons, treaties with mythical species, or technological advancements inspired by magical phenomena. These milestones will serve as anchors, showing how fantasy elements have been an integral part of the world's evolution, not just an afterthought. And you can see that in Martin's work in the way the dragons influenced both Old Valyria and the Kingdom of the Seven, and the Seven Kingdoms. And then, of course, you have to integrate those fantastical elements into societal development and conflict. You have to examine how fantasy elements would have shaped the social fabric and cultural practices. Think about laws, social hierarchies, and educational systems that might evolve in response to the presence of magic or mythical beings. How do these elements affect the economy, from trade in magical goods to industries based around fantastical resources? And finally, ensure there's a dynamic interaction between fantasy elements and historical events. Magic might evolve in response to social needs or crises, and historical events might lead to the discovery or loss of magical knowledge. This feedback loop creates a world where fantasy and history are inextricably linked, making the integration feel natural and believable. By following these steps, you ensure that the fantastical elements of your world are not just pasted on top of a historical framework, but are instead woven into the very fabric of your world's history, culture, and social evolution. And that is how you can use history as a source of inspiration for your fantasy world. What do you think? Are there strategies that I missed? Let me know in the comments. This episode was brought to you by my epic fantasy series, Sangwheel Chronicles. If you'd like to support the channel and read an epic fantasy series, there's a link to my book page down below. However, don't feel pressured to support the channel financially. Another great way you can support the channel is simply by watching another video. Since you liked this video enough to stick around to the end, I would recommend checking out my video on creating a history for your world. Or you can trust the algorithm's recommendation right over there. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds, where we build what we need when we need it.